The November wind cut through Chicago like a blade. Gray clouds pressed down on the skyline, heavy as the emptiness in Maxwell Harrington's chest. His black Bentley glided away from downtown, toward a place he had sworn never to return. At 37, Maxwell Harrington commanded fear without raising his voice. Broad-shouldered, steel-gray eyes, features carved from stone, a predator at rest. His tailored black suit was wrinkled, his jaw shadowed with stubble he hadn't bothered to shave. Small signs that meant nothing to strangers. Everything to those who knew him. 3 years ago, Max smiled, laughed, loved. 3 years ago, Catherine was still alive. The Harrington estate sat 40 miles outside the city. A Victorian mansion Catherine had begged him for, not for its grandeur, but for its gardens, its quiet, its distance from his dark world. For 5 years, it was his sanctuary, the only place Maxwell Harrington could simply be her husband. Then the Castellano family sent their message. They meant to kill him. They killed her instead. Catherine died in his arms on the kitchen floor, her last breath a whisper of his name. Max made them pay, dismantled the Castellano family until nothing remained but ashes and fear. But revenge didn't bring her back. Nothing could. After the funeral, he locked the estate and walked away, moved into a penthouse downtown, existed, but did not live. For 3 years, he never returned, could not face her gardens, her rooms, her ghost in every corner. Until 2 weeks ago. There's a situation at the estate, Jonas, his lieutenant, had said. A woman and children, living on the property. Something doesn't feel right, Max. You should see for yourself. Now the mansion rose before him, windows dark like dead eyes, ivy crawling wild across stone walls, nature reclaiming what grief had abandoned. Max stepped inside, dust, silence, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, Catherine's perfume, jasmine and vanilla. Still clinging to the walls after all this time, he moved to the back windows. The old guest house sat at the edge of the property, half hidden by overgrown hedges. Smoke curled from its chimney. Someone was living there. Max crossed the frozen lawn as darkness fell. Near the door, he stopped and heard a child crying, not a tantrum, the quiet, broken cry of real fear, the kind that came from knowing no one could protect you. Something stirred in his chest, something he thought had died with Catherine. The door swung open. A woman stood in the doorway, backlit by firelight, thin, too thin. Brown hair pulled back, face pale with exhaustion deeper than sleepless nights. Late 20s, though hardship made her look older, her eyes stopped him cold. Brown, deep, holding terror and defiance in equal measure. A cornered animal ready to fight. Behind her, 2 children, a boy, 8, standing guard with small fists clenched. A girl, 5, clinging to her mother's leg, tears streaming down her face. The woman spoke first, voice steady despite trembling hands. I know we shouldn't be here, but please, give us time to gather our things. The children don't deserve to be thrown out into the dark. Max looked at the boy, trying to be brave. The girl with red-rimmed eyes. The mother ready to fight him with bare hands. Somewhere inside him, something cracked. Who are you? Rosalie Brennan. Her voice caught. My husband worked for your organization. He died 2 years ago. We had nowhere else to go. Brennan, a driver, low level, killed during a job gone wrong. Max hadn't known the man had a wife, children. The little girl looked up at him, and he remembered what Catherine always said. The measure of a man isn't the power he wields. It's how he treats those who have none. You can stay, he heard himself say. For now. Rosalie stared, shock replacing defiance. What? But Max was already walking away, leaving the question frozen in the air between them. He didn't understand why he'd said it, didn't know what it meant. All he knew was that for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than emptiness, and he wasn't sure if that terrified him or saved him. If this story moved you, hit like and share it with someone who needs hope. Subscribe now. The next chapter changes everything. Max didn't leave the way he'd planned to. That first night, he sat in the study of the main mansion, a glass of whiskey in his hand but untouched, his eyes fixed on the darkness where the guest house flickered in and out behind the trees. He asked himself what he was doing. Why was he allowing strangers to stay on this land? The very place where Catherine had planted flowers, had laughed, had lived. But every time he meant to step into his car and drive back to the city, he remembered the little girl's eyes, red and swollen from crying, staring at him as if he were the monster about to swallow her whole family. And he stayed. Not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't bring himself to leave. In the days that followed, Max watched them from a distance. From the second-floor window, he could see the guest house and the small yard in front of it. Rosalie woke, while the sky still wasn't fully light. She cleaned. She washed by hand in an old plastic basin. She hung clothes on a rope, hurriedly tied between two trees. She worked without stopping, as if the moment she paused, everything would collapse. The clothes she wore were clean but faded, patched in many places. Her thin frame told him she often gave her share of food to her children. But her back stayed straight, her chin stayed lifted. There was dignity in that woman's poverty, and Max recognized it. Tommy, the 8-year-old boy, was far older than his age. He helped his mother with everything without being told, carrying water, gathering firewood, watching his sister. The boy moved with the caution of a child who'd learned the world wasn't safe, that no one would protect him but himself. Max watched him and saw the shadow of his own self 30 years earlier, before he became the man the entire city had learned to fear. Ellie, the 5-year-old girl, played alone with a torn doll. She talked to it, telling it stories Max couldn't quite make out from where he stood. Sometimes she laughed, and that clear, innocent sound traveled across the yard and touched something inside Max's chest he'd thought had died a long time ago. On the 5th day, everything changed. Max was standing at the window as usual when he saw Tommy climbing the old apple tree at the corner of the yard. The boy reached for the last apples of the season, still clinging to the highest branches. Ellie stood beneath the trunk, looking up and waiting, her eyes bright. Max saw the branch tremble, saw Tommy stretch farther than he should have, saw the instant the boy lost his balance. Rosalie's scream tore through the quiet afternoon. Max didn't remember how he got down the stairs. When he reached them, Tommy was on the ground, his face drained pale with pain, his left arm bent at an unnatural angle. Rosalie knelt beside him, her hands shaking, terrified to touch him, tears streaming down her cheeks. Ellie screamed and sobbed, clinging to her mother's leg. "We need to get him to the hospital," Max said, his voice so steady it surprised even him. "Right now." Rosalie looked up at him, panic in her eyes. "I don't have a car. I don't have money. I don't." Max didn't let her finish. He bent down and, gentle but sure, lifted Tommy into his arms. The boy groaned from the pain but didn't cry. He clamped his lips together, trying to be strong even as his eyes turned red and wet. "Follow me," Max ordered. Not the tone of a man making a suggestion, but the tone of a man who didn't accept refusal. The Bentley flew down the road toward the city. Max drove with one hand, the other keeping Tommy steady in the back seat where Rosalie held him. Ellie sat in the front, eyes wide with astonishment, riding in a car like this for the first time in her life. At the hospital, everything happened fast. Doctors and nurses rushed over the moment they saw Max walk in. No one asked about insurance or a deposit. They knew who he was. Tommy was taken for x-rays, then put in a cast. A clean forearm fracture. It would heal in 6 to 8 weeks. When Rosalie asked about the cost, the receptionist shook her head with a polite smile. "It's already been paid, ma'am." Rosalie turned back to Max, her brown eyes flaring like a struck match. She stepped in front of him, her voice trembling with the effort of holding herself together. "I don't take charity. I'll pay it back. Somehow, I'll pay back every cent." Max looked at her, straight into those proud, wounded eyes. "Your husband died working for my organization." His voice was cold, but it wasn't the cold of cruelty. It was the cold of a man hiding something. "This is a debt I have to pay, not charity." Rosalie fell silent. She wanted to argue, to refuse. But when she looked at her son asleep on the hospital bed under the pull of pain medicine, she swallowed her pride. At least this once. On the way back, Tommy woke up. He looked at his cast, then over at Max behind the wheel. The boy's gaze had changed. The fear and wariness from the first days were gone. In their place was something new. Admiration, gratitude, and maybe a small, fragile thread of hope that, at last, there was someone strong enough to protect his family. Max caught that look in the rearview mirror, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't look away. A week had passed since the day Tommy fell and broke his arm. The boy was recovering well, and the cast had become a strange point of pride, something he showed off to Ellie every day. Life in the guest house slowly settled into something steadier. Rosalie still worked from morning until night, But now there was a little more food in the small refrigerator, left outside the door each morning by someone who never left a note. She knew it was Max, but she didn't dare ask, didn't dare thank him, afraid that if she opened her mouth she'd have to face questions she wasn't ready to answer. That afternoon, a sleek black Mercedes rolled through the estate gate. Max was sitting in his study when he heard the engine. He looked out the window and saw a man step out of the car, tall, salt and pepper hair neatly combed, an expensive gray suit, a courteous smile polished like a high-end salesman. Derek Cole, the property manager and the overseer of the Harrington family's legal businesses for the past 10 years. Max hadn't told anyone he'd come back here. Derek must have come for a routine inspection, never expecting the owner to be home. Max stepped onto the front porch just as Derek approached the steps. The man looked up, and for the briefest moment Max saw something flash in his eyes. Startlement, maybe fear, but as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, replaced by the familiar smile and a respectful bow of the head. "Mr. Harrington," Derek said, his voice smooth as oil. "I didn't know you were back. What a pleasant surprise." "I didn't announce myself," Max replied, his voice empty of emotion. "Is there something wrong?" "Just a routine check, sir. The estate has been left empty for far too long, and I wanted to make sure everything is still in order." Derek's gaze slid toward the guest house, where a thin ribbon of smoke still drifted from the chimney. "Actually, there's an issue I intended to report. There are squatters living in the old house in the back, a woman and 2 children. I discovered them a few weeks ago, but I haven't dealt with it yet because I wanted to wait for your instructions." Max watched Derek as he spoke. The way he put weight on the words "that woman," the look in his eyes as he stared toward the guest house. Something was off, like a note out of tune in the perfect symphony Derek always tried to perform. "They're allowed to be here," Max said slowly, studying Derek's reaction. "You don't need to worry about it." Derek's smile faltered for 1 second. Just one, but it was enough for Max to see. Irritation, even anger, though it was hidden well. "Do you know them?" Derek asked, still polite, but with something sharper underneath. "That's my business," Max replied. "Do you have anything else to report?" Derek shook his head, the smile returning, but it wasn't as natural as before. "No, sir. I won't disturb you any longer." He bowed again and turned toward his car, but before he got in, he stopped and looked back at the guest house one more time. That look, Max realized, wasn't the look of a manager worried about property. It was the look of a predator whose prey had been taken. The Mercedes drove away, leaving a faint cloud of dust over the gravel road. Max stood still on the porch, watching until the car disappeared behind the trees. In the guest house, Rosalie was washing dishes when the late afternoon light through the window was swallowed by a human shadow. She looked up to see who it was, and her whole body locked. The bowl slipped from her hands and dropped into the sink with a small splash, but she didn't hear it. Her ears rang. Her heart stopped for 1 beat, then thrashed wildly, as if it wanted to break through her ribs. Derek Cole, standing there talking to Max Harrington right in front of the main mansion. Survival instinct took over. Rosalie lunged for Tommy and Ellie, who were playing near the window, and dragged them deeper inside with a strength she didn't know she had. She locked the door, pulled the curtains, turned off the lights. All of it within seconds, without a single word of explanation. "Mom," Tommy whispered in the darkness, his voice tight with worry. "Mom, what's going on? Who is that man? Why are you scared?" Rosalie didn't answer. She couldn't. She only pulled both children against her, holding them so tight. Ellie started to cry from not being able to breathe, but Rosalie couldn't let go, couldn't stop shaking. He'd found her. Somehow, he'd found her. Tears ran down Rosalie's cheeks in the dark. How long had she been running? How many nights had she slept in a car, in a park, in the corners of shadowed streets, just to escape that devil wearing a human face? She'd thought that here, in this remote place, she was safe. She'd thought the nightmare was over, but the nightmare had just walked through the estate gate, wearing a gray suit, smiling politely, and standing less than 100 meters away. Tommy held tight to his mother and his little sister, not understanding what was happening, only knowing that for the first time in his life, he'd seen his mother afraid in a way that stole her voice, and that frightened him more than anything he'd ever lived through. Outside, the sky was slowly darkening, and inside the small guest house, a family of 3 sat huddled in the black, waiting for the worst. That night, after Derek left, Max didn't sleep. He sat in the darkened study, the only light coming from his phone screen, casting a pale glow over his impassive, granite expression. The images kept replaying in his mind. The look in Derek's eyes when he glanced toward the guest house. The way he stressed the words "that woman." The flicker of irritation when Max said they were allowed to stay. And then the image of Rosalie slamming the window shut, pulling the curtains, turning off the lights just minutes after Derek appeared. She couldn't have seen him from that distance. But somehow, she knew he was there, and she was afraid. Max picked up his phone and called Jonas. "I need you to do something," Max said the moment Jonas answered, without greeting. "Derek Cole, I want to know everything about him, especially what he's done to the widows of our men. Don't miss a single detail." There was a brief silence on the other end. Jonas had worked for Max for more than 15 years. He knew when to ask questions and when to stay quiet. This was a time for silence. "I understand," Jonas replied. "How long do I have?" "As fast as possible." 48 hours later, Jonas stood in front of Max in the mansion study, a thick leather briefcase in his hand. The 40-year-old man was usually composed and unreadable, but today something was different. A tension, even disgust, lingered behind his sharp eyes. "You're not going to like what I found," Jonas began, setting the briefcase on the desk. "Derek Cole isn't who we thought he was. He's a devil, Max. A devil wearing a human face for 10 years right under our noses." Jonas opened the case and took out file after file, photographs, written reports, and as he began to speak, Max listened to each word as if he were swallowing cold stones down his throat. Derek Cole had helped at least 5 widows of men in the organization over the past decade. 5 women who had lost their husbands, who had no support, and Derek appeared like a savior. He gave them housing, gave them money, gave them hope. Then he demanded repayment. Those who refused were threatened, slandered, thrown out into the street without a single dollar. Some were too frightened to speak. Some disappeared without a trace. And one of them, Patricia Holloway, 34 years old, had taken her own life 2 years ago. She left a letter, but her family was too afraid to make it public. Jonas had found a copy. "She wrote everything," Jonas said, his voice lowering. What he did to her, the threats, how he told her he'd take her 4-year-old son if she dared to tell anyone. She chose death because she thought it was the only way to protect her child. Max said nothing. He simply sat there in silence. But Jonas saw his hand clench until his knuckles turned white, saw his jaw tighten, saw the gray eyes that were usually so cold now burning with a fire Jonas hadn't seen since the day Catherine was murdered. "There's more," Jonas continued. "He's been skimming money from the properties he manages, falsifying books for years. The amounts weren't large enough to draw attention, but added together they're significant. He's used his position in the organization to prey on the vulnerable, on those with no one to protect them, on those too afraid to speak." Jonas paused, as if weighing whether to continue. Then he decided, "There's a widow in Wisconsin who agreed to talk to my people. She escaped Derek 3 years ago, changed her name, changed her address, and has lived in fear ever since. But she told us everything." Jonas placed a recording on the desk. Everything. Max looked at the recording but didn't pick it up. He didn't need to hear it. What Jonas had said was enough. "There's one more thing," Jonas added, more cautiously. "Derek's been in contact with several people outside the organization in the past few months. Encrypted calls, private meetings. We don't know who yet, but I'm tracking it. It could be personal business, or it could be something far more serious." Max finally spoke, his voice so calm it was frightening. It was the calm before a storm makes landfall, before a volcano erupts. Jonas had seen that calm once before, 3 years ago, just before Max wiped the Castellano family off the map. "No one touches him yet," Max said slowly, each word clear as if carved into stone. "I need to hear it from her, from Rosalie." Jonas nodded. He understood. This wasn't just about justice or punishment. It was about a woman and 2 children living in the guest house less than 200 meters away. About what they'd endured. And about the promise Max had unknowingly made to himself the first night he looked into little Ellie's frightened eyes. When Jonas left, Max stood by the window and stared into the darkness. The guest house sat silent. No lights at all. Rosalie must have turned everything off since the afternoon and hadn't dared switch them back on. How afraid of Derek was she that she had to live in the dark like that? Max didn't know the answer, but he would find out. And when he did, Derek Cole would pay for every single tear he'd caused. The next morning, when the first rays of sunlight barely touched the roof of the guest house, Rosalie had already been awake for hours. She hadn't slept at all. Every small sound made her flinch, her heart racing wildly, her eyes fixed on the door as if Derek might burst in at any moment. Tommy and Ellie lay curled beside her on the narrow bed. Ellie whimpered softly in her sleep now and then, and Tommy held his mother's hand even after drifting off, as if afraid she might disappear. Now, while both children were still asleep, Rosalie quietly folded their few pieces of clothing into an old cloth bag. She had to leave, today, before Derek came back. She would find Max, thank him for his kindness over these past weeks, and then vanish. She didn't know where she would go, but anywhere was better than here, where the devil had caught her scent. A knock at the door made Rosalie drop the shirt she was holding. She froze, eyes wide with terror, staring at the door. He'd come back, sooner than she expected. "Miss Brennan." The voice came through, low and steady. "It's me, Max Harrington." Rosalie exhaled, not realizing she'd been holding her breath. She walked to the door and opened it, trying to keep her hands from trembling. Max stood there, still in his black suit, still with those cold eyes. But today there was something different, a tension hidden beneath his composed exterior. "I need to speak with you," Max said. "May I come in?" Rosalie hesitated for a second, then stepped aside. She glanced toward the bed where Tommy and Ellie were still sleeping, as if to make sure they were safe. Max followed her gaze and gave a small nod, lowering his voice. "What did Derek Cole do to you?" The question hit Rosalie like a blow to the chest. She stepped back, avoiding his eyes, her hand tightening unconsciously around the fabric of her blouse. She said nothing. She couldn't. For 2 years she'd learned how to stay silent, how to swallow fear and humiliation, how to pretend everything was fine to protect her children. She didn't know where to begin, and she wasn't sure she could trust the man standing in front of her. Max studied her for a long moment, then he spoke again, his voice even, but with a gentleness he didn't seem aware of. "You may not trust me. That makes sense, because you don't know who I am, but I know what kind of man he is." He paused, choosing each word carefully. "I know about the other women. I know about Patricia Holloway." Rosalie looked up at him, eyes wide with shock. Patricia. She knew Patricia. They'd met once by chance, when both of them were trying to escape the same devil. Patricia had told her what Derek had done, and a few months later, Rosalie heard that Patricia was dead. Suicide, they said. But Rosalie knew the truth. Derek had killed her. Not with a knife or a gun, but with despair. "I only need to hear it from you," Max continued. "Not to accuse you or judge you, but so I know what I have to do." Rosalie looked into his eyes. Those eyes held no pity, the kind she despised. No doubt, the kind she feared. Only patience, waiting, and something that felt like a quiet, simmering rage, but not directed at her. And then, like a dam breaking after years of pressure, Rosalie began to speak. She told him about the day Patrick died. A call at midnight, a stranger's voice telling her her husband would never come home again. She told him about Derek appearing at the funeral, polite and attentive, saying the organization would take care of her and the children. He gave her a small apartment, gave her living money, gave her hope that everything would be all right. She told him about the first night Derek came to the apartment, drunk, demanding repayment for everything he'd done. She refused. He didn't force her that night. He only smiled and said she would change her mind. She told him about the weeks that followed. Derek came back, demanding more each time. When she kept refusing, he began to threaten her. He said he'd accuse her of theft, said he'd call the police and claim she abused her children, said he'd send the children where they belong, meaning an orphanage or worse. Rosalie was terrified, but she still refused. And one night she took her 2 children and ran, carrying nothing but the clothes they were wearing and an old handbag. She told him about the months of wandering, sleeping in a borrowed car until it ran out of gas, and she had no money to refill it, sleeping in cheap motels until the money ran out, sleeping in parks, in bus stations, anywhere that could shelter the 3 of them for a night. She worked every kind of job, washing dishes, cleaning floors, doing laundry, anything that paid in cash without paperwork, because she was afraid Derek would find her if she used her real name anywhere. She told him about the night she found this abandoned guest house. It was raining. Ellie had a fever. Tommy was exhausted from hunger. She was so desperate she would have done anything to give her children a roof over their heads. She broke the old lock, carried them inside, and for the first time in months, they had a place to call home. By the time Rosalie finished, tears were running down her cheeks without her realizing it. Not tears of weakness, but tears of someone who had endured too long in silence and was finally allowed to speak. Max had sat in silence the entire time. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer pity, didn't give empty advice. He only listened, and when she was done, Rosalie saw that his hand was clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "He will never touch you or your children again," Max said, his voice so calm it was terrifying. It wasn't comfort. It was a sentence. "I promise." Rosalie looked into his eyes. For 2 years she'd learned not to trust men, learned to doubt every promise, learned to rely only on herself. But in those eyes, she didn't see deceit, didn't see calculation. She saw the fury of a man who had already lost too much and refused to lose anything more. And for the first time since the day Patrick died, Rosalie allowed herself to believe in a man. 2 days after his conversation with Rosalie, Max called Derek Cole. His voice sounded normal, almost friendly, as he said he wanted to discuss expanding their real estate investments. There were several promising projects, he explained, and he needed someone with Derek's experience to advise him. Derek agreed immediately, the excitement in his voice impossible to hide over the phone. In 10 years of working for the Harrington organization, this was the first time the boss had personally invited him to discuss business. He didn't realize it would also be the last. Derek's black Mercedes rolled through the estate gates at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, right on schedule. He stepped out of the car, adjusted his tie, smoothed his suit jacket, and put on the confident smile of a man who believed he held the world in the palm of his hand. He didn't look toward the guest house. He didn't need to. He knew his prey was still there, and sooner or later he would get what he wanted. Max Harrington might protect her now, but Max wouldn't stay here forever. Max would return to the city, to his business, and when that happened, Derek would have his time. He climbed the steps, knocked, and was led into the mansion study. Max sat behind the large oak desk, his back to the window, the afternoon sunlight forming a dark halo around his silhouette. Jonas stood by the door, silent as a statue, his sharp eyes never leaving Derek for a single second. Derek noticed 2 other men standing in the hallway outside, men he didn't recognize, but he knew exactly who they were. The kind of men who handled work no one spoke about. A flicker of unease passed through Derek's mind, but he quickly brushed it aside. He'd worked for the organization for 10 years without trouble. He'd covered everything perfectly. There was no reason to worry. "Mr. Harrington." Derek smiled and bowed his head. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I'm eager to hear about these new projects." Max didn't respond. He simply looked at Derek for a long moment, his eyes revealing nothing. Then he reached for the leather briefcase on the desk, opened it, and began laying out a thick stack of documents, page after page, slowly and deliberately, like a judge reading out a sentence. Derek stared at the papers, and the smile on his lips began to fade. He recognized what was spread before him: bank statements, fabricated invoices, witness testimonies, and photographs of women he'd believed had disappeared forever, women he thought would never dare to speak. The color drained from Derek's face, shifting from confident flush to a paper-white pallor. He tried to speak, but Max lifted a hand, stopping him. 5 women, Max said evenly, as if reciting a weather report. 5 widows of men in the organization. You helped them, and then you demanded repayment. Those who refused, you threatened, slandered, and threw into the street. "Mr. Harrington, this is a misunderstanding," Derek rushed out, his voice climbing higher than it should, cracking where it shouldn't. "Those women were willing. They needed help, and I helped them. If anyone says otherwise, they're lying." "Patricia Holloway," Max cut in, and the 2 words silenced Derek as if a hand had closed around his throat. 34 years old, widow, 1 4-year-old son. She took her own life 2 years ago. She left a letter accusing you. Her family was too afraid to speak. Max paused, his eyes like twin blades piercing straight through Derek. "They're not afraid anymore." Derek opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He glanced at Jonas, searching for support, but Jonas's eyes were as cold as a serpent's. There were no allies in this room, no escape. 10 years of concealment, 10 years of exploiting the vulnerable under the shield of his position, and it all collapsed in less than 10 minutes. Derek's legs gave out. He dropped to his knees on the floor, hands clasped as if in prayer, his voice trembling and pitiful. "Mr. Harrington, please. I've served the organization for 10 years. I can explain. Please give me a chance." Max didn't look at him. He turned to Jonas, his voice steady, without a single tremor. "Strip him of everything. Assets, position, identity within the organization. As of this moment, he's no longer a Harrington man." Jonas nodded and stepped forward, pulling Derek to his feet. Derek continued begging, tears streaming down his face, but Max had already turned away as if he no longer existed. "Get him out of the estate," Max added. "He has 24 hours to disappear from Illinois. If he dares to return within 500 miles, or if he contacts Miss Brennan." Max paused, finally turning to look at Derek. Those eyes held no burning rage, only the cold of a man who had made a decision and would never reverse it. "Then there won't be a warning." Derek was dragged from the room, head lowered, shoulders slumped like a defeated animal. He didn't resist anymore, didn't beg anymore, just walked in silence between the two men escorting him. But just before stepping through the door, Derek turned back for one last look at Max. And in that moment, Jonas saw what Max didn't, because he'd already turned his back. Derek's eyes no longer held fear, no longer desperation, only hatred. A wild, blazing hatred, burning like the fires of hell, belonging to a man who had lost everything and now had nothing left to lose. Jonas memorized that look, and he knew this wasn't the end. Derek didn't leave Illinois as ordered. He drove to a cheap bar on the outskirts of Chicago, sat in the darkest corner, and drank. He drank until the first bottle of whiskey was empty. Then the second. He drank to forget the humiliation of kneeling before Max Harrington, drank to forget the 10 years he'd spent building his position in the organization, now reduced to nothing. Drank to forget everything he'd lost. But the more he drank, the less he forgot. Instead, the hatred inside him only grew, boiling like lava waiting to erupt. It was all that woman's fault. Rosalie Brennan. If she'd obeyed from the beginning, if she'd repaid him like the others, none of this would have happened. But she'd run. She'd spoken to Harrington. She'd ruined his life. And now, if he couldn't have what he wanted, then no one would. The clock struck 2 a.m. when Derek stopped his car about half a mile from the Harrington estate gates. He turned off the headlights, killed the engine, and stepped out into the dark. 10 years working there meant he knew every corner of the property. He knew where the fence was lowest, which paths had no cameras, how to approach the guest house without being seen. In his hand was a kitchen knife he'd taken from his temporary apartment, the blade long and glinting under the faint moonlight. Rosalie was asleep when the sound woke her. It wasn't loud, just the faint crunch of gravel beneath someone's feet outside the window, but the instinct of a mother who'd lived in fear for 2 years made her sit upright at once. She lay still, listening, her heart pounding against her ribs. It could have been a stray animal, could have been the wind, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. She knew this feeling. She'd felt it many times during the month she was running. Derek had found her. Rosalie didn't have time to be afraid. She rushed to the bed where Tommy and Ellie were sleeping, shook them awake, covered their mouths before they could cry out. In the darkness, she led them to the old wardrobe in the corner of the room, pushed them inside, and knelt to their level. "Listen to me," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you don't come out. You don't make a sound. Do you understand?" Tommy nodded, eyes wide in the dark, his casted arm wrapped tightly around his sister, who was crying without sound. The 8-year-old boy didn't ask why, didn't demand an explanation. He'd learned that sometimes survival mattered more than understanding. Rosalie closed the wardrobe doors just as the pounding began, violent and unhinged. "Rosalie," Derek's voice roared from outside, slurred with alcohol but thick with hatred. "Open the door. You think Harrington can protect you. You ruined my life. You took everything from me." Rosalie didn't answer. She ran to the kitchen, grabbed the largest knife she had, and returned to stand in front of the wardrobe where her children were hiding. Her hands shook, but she tightened her grip on the handle, eyes fixed on the door as it shuddered under blows and kicks from outside. "You can't hide," Derek screamed, his voice cracking in madness. "I'll find you. The door exploded inward. Hinges snapped, wood splintered, and Derek burst inside like a rabid animal. His eyes were bloodshot, his face twisted by alcohol and rage, the knife in his hand flashing under the moonlight spilling through the window. Rosalie didn't run. She couldn't. Behind her was the wardrobe, and inside it were her children. She would die before letting him touch them. Derek lunged, knife raised. Rosalie swung in defense, the blade slicing across his arm, blood spraying. Derek howled in pain, but the pain only drove him further into frenzy. He struck her across the face, a blow so hard she fell to the floor, the knife slipping from her hand. Her head hit the leg of a chair. Her vision blurred, and she saw Derek looming over her, knife lifted, ready to plunge down. That was when the darkness erupted. Max came in like a storm. He didn't speak, didn't warn. He acted. His shoulder slammed into Derek, sending him crashing away from Rosalie. The knife clattered across the floor. Derek tried to get up, tried to fight back, but Max gave him no chance. The punches fell, precise and ruthless, not from a man out of control, but from one who knew exactly what he was doing. This was Maxwell Harrington, the man who'd wiped out an entire Mafia family to avenge his wife. Derek Cole was nothing compared to the enemies Max had faced before. The confrontation ended in less than a minute. Derek lay motionless on the floor, face swollen, blood pouring from his nose and mouth, gasping like a dying animal. Max stood over him, fists clenched, knuckles bruised and smeared with blood that wasn't his. Rosalie crawled to her feet and staggered to the wardrobe, yanking the doors open. Tommy and Ellie were inside, clinging to each other, eyes soaked with tears. She pulled them into her arms, holding them so tight they could barely breathe, silent tears streaming down her face. Max turned to look at them, and in that moment, Rosalie saw something she'd never seen in those eyes. Not anger, not ice, but fear. The fear of a man who'd nearly lost something important, something he hadn't even realized had become so important. Jonas arrived 15 minutes later with 2 other men. They dragged Derek away without needing Max to say a word. But before they left, Max spoke, his voice calm, yet final. "Somewhere no one will find him, until I decide what to do with him." Jonas nodded. He understood. This time, there would be no 24 hours, no chance to walk away freely. Derek Cole had signed his own death sentence. When everyone was gone and only silence remained in the wrecked room, Max stood by the shattered window, staring into the night. Rosalie sat on the floor, still holding her children, saying nothing. No one spoke. But in that silence, something had changed. An invisible thread had been tied between them, stronger than any words could ever describe. Max didn't sleep that night. After Jonas and the others took Derek away, after Rosalie put the children back to bed and soothed them into uneasy sleep, Max stepped outside and sat down on the front steps of the guest house. He didn't return to the main mansion, didn't leave. He just sat there in the dark, his back against the wooden post, his eyes fixed on the gravel road fading into the night. Jonas had called to confirm that Derek was secured in a safe location, that he couldn't escape again, that everything was under control. But Max remained where he was, because some things can't be controlled with locks and chains, because he'd once believed Catherine was safe, and she died in his arms, because he couldn't endure that again. The November night wind cut through the air, sharp and cold, but Max felt nothing. He simply kept watch, like a loyal dog guarding his pack. Now and then he looked up at the sky, where stars flickered between gray clouds. Catherine loved stargazing. She used to say each star was a soul watching over the living. Max didn't believe in things like that. But tonight, he found himself wondering if Catherine was watching him, if she was angry, if she understood. Dawn arrived slowly, staining the horizon from deep violet to rose and then pale gold. Max was still in the same spot, eyes red from lack of sleep, but not tired. He heard the door open behind him, soft footsteps, and then Rosalie appeared at his side, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She didn't speak. She just handed one to him and sat beside him on the steps. They watched the sun rise in silence. Rosalie didn't ask why he'd stayed out there all night. She knew, and she didn't need him to say it. Max didn't explain why he hadn't left. He didn't need to. Their presence beside each other was enough. A conversation without words, a promise never spoken aloud. The coffee warmed their hands in the cold morning air. The first sunlight touched their faces, pushing back the darkness of the night before. And in that moment, they both felt something they'd lost long ago. Peace. The faint creak of a door broke the stillness. Max turned and saw Ellie standing in the doorway, hair tangled, eyes heavy with sleep, her torn doll clutched tightly in her arms. She looked at Max for a long moment, as if weighing a decision. Then, without a word, she ran to him, climbed into his lap, and wrapped her arms around his neck. Max went still. 3 years. 3 years since anyone had hugged him. The last time had been Catherine, before she was gone forever. 3 years of living inside a shell of ice, not letting anyone touch him, not letting himself reach for anyone. And now a 5-year-old girl was holding him as if he were the most precious thing in her world, as if she believed he could shield her from every shadow. Slowly, as though relearning something long forgotten, Max lifted his arms and held her back. His rough hand rested gently on her small back, awkward and hesitant, but real. Ellie was warm against him, small and fragile, and Max realized he was trembling. Not from the cold, from something else, something thawing inside him. The ice he'd built over the past 3 years beginning to melt. Rosalie watched, and tears streamed down her face. Not tears of pain or fear like so many before, but tears of hope, of belief that maybe, after everything, life still held something good waiting for them. Tommy appeared in the doorway soon after. He stood there, watching his sister cling to Max, watching his mother cry with a smile on her lips, and he understood. No one had to explain. The 8-year-old boy, older than his years, understood that something was changing. Something good. He walked over, sat beside Max, and leaned quietly against his shoulder. No words. None were needed. And Max sat there, a little girl in his lap, a boy at his side, a woman across from him, sunlight falling over all of them. He didn't know what to call this feeling, but it was warm, warmer than anything he'd felt in 3 years. In the days that followed, Max worked. He called in men to repair the guest house door Derek had kicked in. Then he didn't stop there. He had the roof replaced, because the old one leaked. Installed heating because winter was coming. Set up a modern security system with cameras and alarms. He didn't ask Rosalie's permission, didn't wait for her to agree or refuse. He simply did it, and Rosalie didn't protest. She understood this was how Max showed he cared, through action instead of words, through deeds instead of empty promises. A week after that terrible night, another car pulled up in front of the mansion. An older woman stepped out, white hair neatly pinned at the nape of her neck, back straight despite her years, sharp eyes softened by warmth. Maggie Thornton, the Harrington family's housekeeper for more than 30 years, the woman who'd cared for Max since he was a boy. When she saw Max step out of the mansion, Maggie stopped. She studied him for a long moment, his clothes worn from days of use, his face clean-shaven, his eyes still cool but holding something different now, deeper, more alive. Then tears filled her eyes and she walked forward, wrapping her arms around him as if embracing a son who'd been lost. "You're home," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Truly home. Max didn't speak. He simply stood there and let her hold him, awkward and unaccustomed to affection, but not pulling away. And when Maggie finally released him, wiping her tears, and looked toward the guest house where Rosalie stood with her children, she smiled softly. "So this is why," she said, and Max didn't deny it. Tommy began following Max like a small shadow. Wherever Max went, the boy was there. Curious brown eyes, so like his mother's, watching everything he did. His mouth never stopping. "Why do you fix it like that? How does that work? Where did you learn? Have you ever traveled far?" At first, Max didn't know what to do with him. He'd lived alone for too long, had forgotten how to speak to ordinary people, let alone a child. His answers were short, sometimes just a nod or a shake of his head, and he wondered why the boy didn't wander off to find something more interesting. But Tommy didn't leave. He stayed, patient as a puppy waiting for its master. And little by little, Max realized he was getting used to the boy's presence. One afternoon, while Max was repairing a leaking faucet in the guest house, Tommy crouched beside him, watching intently. Max glanced at the boy, at the arm still in a cast, and suddenly remembered himself at that age. A child with no one to teach him, forced to learn everything through painful mistakes. He didn't want Tommy to grow up that way. "Come here," Max said, his voice still deep but no longer cold. "I'll show you." And he began teaching Tommy small things: how to use a wrench, how tight a bolt should be, how to study a problem before trying to fix it. Those afternoons slowly grew into more. Max taught Tommy to play chess on an old board he found in the mansion storage room. He showed him how to stand straight when speaking to adults, how to look someone in the eye, how to shake hands firmly. Small lessons, not written in any book, but the kind of lessons a man needs. Tommy absorbed it all like a dry sponge meeting water. He'd lost his father at 6 years old, had no one to teach him these things, and now that someone was willing to give him time, he didn't waste a second of it. Ellie changed too. She no longer feared the big scary man the way she had in the beginning. Instead, she clung to Max whenever she could. One evening, while Rosalie was busy cooking, Ellie tugged on Max's hand, pulled him toward an old armchair, and climbed into his lap. "Tell me a story, Mr. Max," she demanded, her wide eyes full of expectation. Max froze. A story. He didn't know any fairy tales. He'd grown up in a world without them, a world of blood, money, and power. He knew nothing about princesses and princes, witches or elves. But looking into Ellie's waiting eyes, he couldn't refuse. "I don't know fairy tales," Max said slowly, "but I can tell you about places I've been." And he began. He told her about Paris, where a tall iron tower rises above the city, and you can see everything from its top. About Tokyo, where the streets shine as bright as day even at midnight. About Venice, where people travel by boat instead of by car. He told her edited versions, cutting away the darkness, keeping only the wonder. Ellie listened with wide eyes and parted lips, as if he were describing magical kingdoms. And when she fell asleep in his arms, Max realized something strange. He felt at peace, for the first time in a very long time. Then came an evening when all of them sat around the dining table in the main mansion for the first time. Maggie prepared dinner, a true family meal with roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and apple pie for dessert. Tommy talked about the new school he'd been accepted into, about the books he was reading, about the new friend he'd made. Ellie laughed, waved her hands, asked for more gravy. Rosalie listened with a soft smile, adding a few words now and then, and Max sat there, quiet as always, but his eyes were no longer empty. Rosalie glanced over and saw Max cutting Ellie's meat into small pieces, carefully avoiding the tough parts, making them small enough for her to chew. He did it naturally, as if he'd done it his whole life, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. And something tightened in Rosalie's chest, a feeling she didn't dare to name. Max looked up, as if sensing her gaze. Gray eyes met brown. In that brief moment, something passed between them. A small spark, a silent acknowledgement. Then both quickly looked away, Rosalie lowering her eyes to her plate, Max returning to the piece of meat in his hand. Maggie observed it all, a faint smile on her lips. She said nothing, but in her heart she knew. This house was coming back to life. Her boy was coming back to life. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Max walked alone into the room he'd avoided for 3 years, the bedroom he'd shared with Catherine. The room remained exactly as it had been the day she left, from the scarf draped over the chair to the perfume bottle on the vanity. Max sat on the edge of the bed, holding their wedding photo in its silver frame. Catherine was smiling in the picture, radiant and alive, her hand woven into his, her eyes looking at him as if he were her entire world. "Are you angry with me, Kate?" Max whispered, his voice rough in the quiet night. "If I start living again." There was no answer. Only the night breeze drifting through the window, carrying the scent of jasmine from the garden Catherine had planted. And Max sat there alone, the photograph in his hands, silent tears sliding down his face for the first time in 3 years. Jonas's black car rolled through the estate gates early that morning, earlier than usual, and Max knew at once something was wrong. Jonas wasn't a man who disturbed him over small matters. If he came in person instead of calling, it meant the issue was more serious than anything that could be handled over the phone. They met in the mansion study, the heavy oak door closed tight. Max sat behind the desk while Jonas stood across from him, his face more strained than usual. "There's a problem with the shipment at the port," Jonas began, his voice low and urgent. "The Moretti family is applying pressure. They want control of the southern route back, and they're not afraid to use force. 2 of our men were injured this week." Max frowned. "Moretti. I thought we had an agreement with them 5 years ago." "We had an agreement with old man Moretti," Jonas replied, shaking his head. "His son took over last month. The kid's more ambitious than his father ever was, and he wants to prove himself. He chose us as his first target." Max fell silent, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. This was the kind of problem he'd avoided for 3 years, leaving everything to Jonas while he drowned in the grief of losing Catherine. But there were decisions Jonas couldn't make alone, decisions that could mean war or peace, life or death. We need the boss to decide, Jonas said plainly. If we don't act soon, Moretti will think we're weak. And when they think we're weak, Max finished the sentence. They'll strike. I understand. Give me time to think. I'll have an answer tonight. Outside the study, Rosalie was walking down the hallway carrying a tray of tea Maggie had asked her to bring upstairs. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the thick wooden door couldn't completely block the voices inside, especially when they were speaking with such urgency. Shipment at the port. The Moretti family is applying pressure. We need the boss to decide. Rosalie froze in the hallway, the tray trembling in her hands so hard the cups clinked against each other. Boss. They called Max boss. Not the owner of an ordinary company. Boss in the way Patrick used to say it when referring to the head of the organization. Boss in the way the underworld used it for the men who held the power of life and death. She'd known Patrick worked for an organization. She'd known his work wasn't entirely legal, but she'd never asked, never wanted the details, because she loved Patrick and believed he was a good man regardless of what he did. Now, standing in the hallway of this mansion, she realized she'd been closing her eyes to the truth for too long. Max Harrington wasn't just a wealthy businessman who'd taken her family in out of kindness. He was the boss, the head of the very organization Patrick had worked for and died for. Rosalie set the tray down on a nearby table, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't hold it any longer. She turned and walked away, her heart racing, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions. All that day she avoided Max. When he entered a room, she found an excuse to leave. When he asked if she needed anything, she answered shortly and walked off. She knew she was acting strangely, knew Max was watching her with quiet curiosity, but she needed time. Time to think, to decide whether this changed everything. Max noticed the shift immediately. He'd lived too long in a world where observation meant survival not to see when someone was avoiding him. But he didn't push. He gave her space and waited, even though each passing hour felt like a day. That evening, Max found Rosalie in the garden behind the mansion. She was sitting on the old stone bench Catherine had once loved, staring into the open space where moonlight washed over flower beds wilted by winter. He approached and stopped a few steps away, not sitting down. You heard, Max said. It wasn't a question. He knew, and he had no intention of circling around it. Rosalie didn't look at him. She kept her gaze on the garden, her voice quiet but steady in the still night. Who are you, really? Max was silent for a long moment. He could lie. He could invent a story, offer a reasonable explanation for what she'd overheard. But looking at her back, at the tension in her shoulders as if bracing for a blow, he knew a lie would only make it worse. She deserved the truth, even if the truth might drive her away forever. I'm the head of the Harrington family, Max said evenly. I control part of this city's underworld. What you heard is true. What you're thinking about me probably isn't wrong. He paused and drew in a slow breath. I'm the kind of man you should stay away from, the kind ordinary people shouldn't be involved with. Rosalie finally turned to face him. Her brown eyes shimmered in the moonlight, not with tears but with something else. Conflict, confusion, and perhaps a trace of hurt. But I'm also the man who protected you from Derek Cole, Max continued, his voice softening. The man who'll protect you and your children with my life if I have to. That doesn't change, no matter who I am. He held her gaze. Who do you choose to see? Rosalie didn't answer. She simply looked at him for a long moment, her deep eyes revealing nothing of her thoughts. Then she stood, turned her back, and walked into the house without a word. Max remained in the garden alone, watching her disappear behind the door, and for the first time in a very long while, he felt afraid. Not of enemies, not of death, but of losing something he'd only just realized he had. Rosalie didn't sleep that night. She lay awake in the guest house, staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. Beside her, Tommy and Ellie slept peacefully, their breathing steady and soft, unaware that their mother was wrestling with a decision that could change all three of their lives. Max Harrington was the boss of the underworld, the head of a criminal organization, the kind of man ordinary citizens only heard about in movies or on the news, the kind they were always warned to avoid. Rosalie thought about everything she'd witnessed in the past few weeks, the way Jonas and the others bowed their heads to Max, the way Derek Cole had been dealt with without police or courtrooms, the way everything moved at the command of a single word from Max's mouth. This wasn't her world. It was a dangerous one, where blood could spill at any moment, where enemies could step out of any shadow. But then she thought about Patrick. Her husband had lived in that world too. He'd worked for the Harrington organization for years, and he'd been the best man Rosalie had ever known. He loved her, loved their children, never allowed the darkness of his work to touch his family. If Patrick could be a good man in that world, why couldn't Max? She thought about everything Max had done for them. He let them stay when he could have thrown them out that first night. He took Tommy to the hospital and paid every expense without asking for anything in return. He listened as she told him about Derek. Without judgment, without doubt, just listening, and then promising to protect her. He kept that promise when Derek attacked. He sat guard outside their home all night without being asked. He repaired the house, brought Maggie back, enrolled the children in school, gave them a life they'd never dared to imagine. Were those the actions of a bad man? Rosalie wondered. Or the actions of a good man trapped in a bad world? She didn't find the answer as dawn crept through the window. She was still lying there, eyes burning from exhaustion, her heart heavy with unresolved thoughts, when Tommy woke up and everything shifted. "Mom?" Tommy sat up, rubbing his eyes, staring at the cloth bag Rosalie had taken from the corner the night before. "Are we leaving?" Rosalie didn't know how to answer. She opened her mouth, but Tommy spoke again, his voice trembling. "I don't want to go, Mom. I like it here. I like my new school. I like Maggie." He paused, eyes dropping as if gathering courage for what came next. "I like Mr. Max. He teaches me things. He makes me—" Tommy looked up, his eyes shining. "He makes me remember Dad." Before Rosalie could respond, Ellie woke too. She saw the bag, saw her mother's face and her brother's, and immediately sensed something was wrong. Her lower lip began to tremble, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't want to go," she cried, running to wrap her arms around Rosalie. "I don't want to leave Mr. Max," Ellie sobbed, then corrected herself in a whisper. "Daddy Max." Rosalie froze. "Daddy Max? Daddy Max tells me stories every night," Ellie sobbed. "Daddy Max cuts my meat. Daddy Max carries me when I'm scared. I love Daddy Max, Mommy. I don't want to leave him." Rosalie didn't know when Ellie had started calling Max Daddy. She hadn't noticed the shift, too consumed by her own fears and doubts. But now, hearing her daughter cry for Daddy Max, her heart broke open. She pulled Ellie close, gathered Tommy in as he joined them, and she cried with them. She'd searched for answers all night, but the answer had been right here, in her arms, in her daughter's tears, in her son's shining eyes. The children had already chosen, and perhaps her heart had chosen long ago. An hour later, Rosalie stepped out of the guest house. She saw Max standing on the porch of the main mansion, facing her, as if he'd been there all night waiting. He looked tired, stubble shadowing his jaw, dark circles under his eyes. But when he saw her walking toward him, he straightened, his eyes never leaving her. Rosalie stopped in front of him, close enough to see the lines of weariness on his face, far enough to keep a small distance. She drew in a deep breath. "I'm not naive, Mr. Harrington," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "I know who you are. I know your world is dangerous. I know staying here might mean putting my children in harm's way." She paused, swallowing hard. "But I also know what you've done for my family. I know you saved us when no one else cared. My daughter calls you Daddy." Her voice caught. "My son looks at you like you're a hero. And She couldn't finish. The words lodged in her throat, too large and too fragile to release. Max stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He stood close enough for her to see the relief softening his usually cold eyes, close enough for her to feel his warmth in the crisp morning air. "You don't have to say anything," Max said gently. "Just stay." Rosalie looked at him, looked into eyes no longer empty as they had been the day they first met, looked at the face of the man who'd given her family a second chance when the world had turned its back, and she nodded. The months that followed passed like a dream Rosalie hardly dared to believe was real. The Harrington estate came back to life day by day, transforming from a place heavy with dust and sorrowful memories into a true home. Rosalie officially became the manager of the mansion, a position Max offered and she accepted after many days of careful thought. She rearranged each room, opened the windows to let light pour in, replaced the old curtains with new ones, set fresh flowers in vases she found tucked away in storage. Maggie helped with the heavier tasks, and little by little the mansion began to breathe again. Max still ran the Harrington organization, but somehow he found a balance he'd never thought possible. He handled business through phone calls and his laptop, went into the city only when absolutely necessary, and spent most of his time at the estate. Jonas came more often now to report and receive instructions, and he couldn't hide his surprise at the change in Max. He was still sharp, still decisive, but something was different. A quiet peace Jonas had never seen in him, not even in the years when Catherine was alive. Tommy was accepted into a good private school in the nearby town. For the first time in his life, he had a new uniform, a new backpack, friends his own age to play with. He no longer had to be older than his years, no longer had to worry about the next meal or where they'd sleep at night. He began to dream about the future, talking about becoming a lawyer to protect people like his mother, people who were bullied and had no one to help them. Max listened to him speak, and something warm spread quietly through his chest. Ellie was like a flower finally watered after too many dry days. She became lively and bright, her clear laughter echoing through the mansion from morning until evening. She loved to draw, sketching everything she saw: the garden, the sun, Maggie, and Daddy Max. Her colorful, uneven drawings covered the walls of the guest house and slowly made their way into the main mansion after Maggie declared them beautiful. Max noticed her passion, and one day he cleared out a small room on the ground floor and turned it into a private art studio, just for Ellie. He bought an easel, paints, brushes, everything he imagined a young artist might need. When Ellie saw the room, she cried with joy and threw her arms around Max's neck, and he had to fight hard not to cry with her. One late winter night, as the snow began to melt and the first green shoots pushed through the garden soil, Max couldn't sleep. He wandered through the mansion, his steps unconsciously leading him to the large sitting room where Catherine's painting still hung on the wall. He stopped when he realized someone was already there. Rosalie stood in front of the painting, her back to him, her head tilted slightly upward to see it more clearly. The painting showed the garden, as seen from the bedroom window, jasmine blossoms in full bloom under summer sunlight, colors bright and alive. Catherine had painted it in their first year there, when she was still filled with hope and dreams. She was very beautiful, Rosalie said softly, when she heard his footsteps. She turned, a little embarrassed at being caught. "I saw her photograph in your room, and this painting." She looked back at it. She was very talented. Max moved to stand beside her, both of them gazing at the canvas. In the darkness lit only by moonlight through the windows, his face softened, no longer carved in its usual hardness. "Kate would have liked you," Max said quietly. "You're like her in some ways, stronger than anyone I've ever known." Rosalie shook her head gently. "I don't want to replace anyone." Max turned to her, gray eyes meeting brown in the pale light. "You're not replacing anyone," he said, his voice softer and more sincere than she'd ever heard. "You're you, and that's enough." They stood there in silence, shoulders brushing, looking up at the painting. Then somehow, their hands found each other in the dark, fingers intertwined, tentative and careful, as if both feared that one wrong movement would shatter the moment, but neither pulled away. They stood hand in hand, two broken hearts finding one another in the quiet night, and for the first time, both of them felt that perhaps they didn't have to be alone anymore. Late that night, after Max had returned to his room, his phone vibrated. "Jonas." "There's something I need to tell you," Jonas said, his voice tighter than usual, carrying a note that made Max sit up straight at once. "But not now. Not over the phone." Max was silent for a moment. He looked out the window, where the guest house light was still on. Rosalie probably couldn't sleep either, perhaps replaying the moment in the sitting room, perhaps wondering what it all meant. "Tomorrow," Max said, and ended the call. He didn't know what Jonas was about to tell him, but deep down, he had the uneasy sense that the peace they'd found wouldn't last forever. Jonas arrived at the estate at dawn, earlier than the birds beginning to sing. His face was tight, worry etched deep across his brow, and Max knew at once the news wouldn't be good. They met in the study, the door shut, the curtains drawn as if even the morning light wasn't permitted to witness this conversation. "Derek Cole has escaped," Jonas said plainly. "Late last night, the guard was bribed. By the time we discovered it, it was too late." Max stood motionless, his eyes darkening like a sky before a storm. He had been free for only hours, but for a man like Derek, that was enough time to set his poison in motion. "What else?" Max asked, his voice cold and controlled, though Jonas knew that was only the surface. Beneath it, a storm was forming. Jonas drew in a slow breath. "He's contacted the Moretti family, those encrypted calls we detected earlier. We now know he'd been feeding them information long before you exposed him. And after he escaped, he sold everything, Max. Jonas hesitated, as if the next words were ones he wished he didn't have to say. Information about the organization, about assets, shipping routes, your vulnerabilities. His gaze shifted toward the window where the guest house stood beyond the trees. About her. And the children. A chill moved through Max. Jonas's words struck like bullets through his chest, each one an invisible wound. History was repeating itself, exactly as he'd always feared. Catherine had died because enemies targeted his weakness, because someone wanted to hurt him by taking away the woman he loved. And now the same script was unfolding again, with Rosalie, with Tommy, with Ellie. "Has Moretti acted yet?" Max asked, his voice so calm it was frightening. "Not yet, but our sources say the younger Moretti is very interested in information about your new family." Jonas met Max's eyes. He sees it as an opportunity. Hurt you first, then strike. Max turned toward the window. From here he could see the guest house, the thin ribbon of smoke rising from the chimney. Proof that Rosalie was awake preparing breakfast. Maybe Tommy was helping set the table. Maybe Ellie was drawing while she waited to eat. They were safe, happy, unaware that darkness was drawing closer, and Max knew what he had to do. He tightened security immediately. More guards, more cameras, stronger alarms. He ordered Jonas to track every movement of Moretti and Derek, to report to him hourly. But that wasn't all. Max began distancing himself from Rosalie and the children. He no longer joined them for dinner, claiming work. He stopped telling Ellie stories before bed, saying he was busy. He stopped teaching Tommy chess, stopped answering the boys' eager questions. He became Maxwell Harrington from 3 years ago. Cold, distant, a wall of stone no one could penetrate. If he wasn't close to them, his enemies wouldn't target them. If he didn't matter to them, they wouldn't become his weakness. That was the logic he repeated to himself each night as he lay alone staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about Ellie's smile, Tommy's trusting eyes, or the way Rosalie's fingers had intertwined with his in the dark that night. Rosalie noticed the change immediately. She didn't know what had happened, only that the man who'd held her hand in the dark, who'd told her she was enough, now looked at her as if she were a stranger. He no longer smiled when he saw her, no longer paused to talk, no longer stood at the window watching the guest house. He disappeared into his study, emerging only when necessary, and even then he avoided her gaze. Tommy was the first to ask, "Mom, is Mr. Max mad at us?" The boy sat at the table, his plate barely touched, eyes heavy with sadness. "Did I do something wrong? He doesn't teach me chess anymore. He doesn't talk to me." Rosalie didn't know how to answer. She pulled her son close, told him Mr. Max had a lot of work, that it wasn't his fault, that everything would be fine. But she didn't believe her own words. Ellie was worse. She cried every night, whispering Daddy Max in her sleep, waking with swollen eyes and asking why Daddy Max didn't love her anymore. Rosalie held her daughter, sang her back to sleep, and once Ellie was resting, she cried alone in the dark. After a week, Rosalie couldn't bear it any longer. She went to the study and pushed the door open without knocking. Max stood by the window, his back to her, his posture tight as a drawn wire. "You owe me an explanation," Rosalie said, her voice no longer gentle but firm and aching. "Ellie cries every night. Tommy thinks he's done something wrong, and I don't know what to tell them." Max didn't turn around. "You should take the children somewhere else," he said evenly, his voice like ice. "It would be safer." "Safer?" Rosalie stepped closer, trying to see his face. "Or are you just pushing us away?" Max said nothing. He didn't turn, didn't move. Rosalie stood there waiting, hoping he'd say something, anything, to explain this sudden coldness. But he remained still as stone. Then she saw what she had almost missed. His shoulders were trembling, just slightly, barely noticeable, but she was close enough to see. Those broad, powerful shoulders were shaking as if the man was using every ounce of strength to contain something inside him. Rosalie wanted to step forward, to touch him, to say she understood even if she didn't. But the coldness in his voice, the distance in his stance, stopped her. She turned, walked out of the room, and closed the door behind her. But she didn't leave. She didn't walk away from the estate, because she had seen his shoulders tremble. And she knew that even if he was pushing her away, his heart didn't want to. Rosalie didn't leave the way Max wanted her to. She stayed, caring for the children, continuing her work, managing the mansion. But deep inside, she knew something wasn't right. Max's sudden distance wasn't because he'd stopped caring. The tremor in his shoulders when she confronted him had told her that much. Something was happening that she didn't know about, and she was determined to find out. The opportunity came one afternoon, when Jonas arrived at the estate, while Max was in the city handling business. Rosalie intercepted him on the porch, her eyes firm, leaving him no room to avoid her. "I need the truth," she said plainly, "about why Max has changed, about what's going on that he won't tell me." Jonas studied her, weighing his choice. He'd worked for Max long enough to know the boss didn't want Rosalie involved, but he'd lived long enough to understand that even the smartest man can make the worst decisions when fear clouds his judgment. "He'll be angry with me for this," Jonas sighed. "But you deserve to know," and he told her everything. About Derek's escape, about the information sold to the Moretti family, about the threat aimed at her and the children, about why Max had suddenly turned distant, as if she were a stranger. "He's afraid of losing you," Jonas said quietly, like he lost Catherine. "He thinks that if he pushes you away, if you don't matter to him, then his enemies won't target you. You'll be safe." Rosalie stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing it all. Then she let out a short laugh, bitter and aching. "He's the smartest man I've ever met," she said, "but he's a fool when it comes to this." Jonas didn't argue. In truth, he agreed. That night, when Max returned, Rosalie was waiting in the study. She sat in the chair across from his desk, hands resting on her knees, back straight, eyes fixed on the door. When Max stepped inside and saw her, he paused at the threshold, surprise flickering across his face before settling back into his usual cold expression. "I know about Moretti," Rosalie said before he could speak. "I know Derek escaped. I know you're trying to push me away to protect me." Max stood still for a moment, then entered and closed the door behind him. His face revealed nothing. "Then you understand why you have to leave." "No." Rosalie rose to her feet and faced him. "I understand why I have to stay." Max opened his mouth to protest, but she didn't let him. She stepped closer, closing the space between them, lifting her chin to meet his gray eyes that were trying so hard to remain distant. "Catherine didn't die because she loved you," Rosalie said steadily. "She died because your enemies were cruel. That wasn't your fault, and pushing me away won't stop the same thing from happening if they truly want to hurt you." She drew in a breath. "You can't spend your life pushing people away out of fear of losing them, Max. That isn't protection. That's surrender." "You don't understand," Max began, his voice faltering. "I do," Rosalie cut in. "I understand losing the person you love. When Patrick died, I wanted to die with him. I thought about giving up 100 times during those months on the streets, but I had my children. They needed me, so I kept living for them." She lifted her hand and gently touched his cheek, feeling the rough stubble beneath her palm. "And now I have you. No matter how many times you try to push me away, I'm not running. Not ever again." Max looked at her, his eyes no longer sharp but filled with pain and confusion. He'd built walls around himself for 3 years, sworn never to let anyone close, never to have another weakness. But this woman, with her steady brown eyes and fearless voice, had torn those walls down brick by brick. And now she stood in front of him, refusing to leave even after he'd tried his hardest to drive her away. "Aren't you afraid?" Max asked hoarsely. "Moretti could do anything. They could, I am afraid," Rosalie admitted. "I'm afraid every day. For my children, for myself, for you. But I lived in fear for 2 years running from Derek, and I learned something." She held his gaze. "Living in fear alone is far more painful than facing fear with the person you love. The person you love." The words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Rosalie didn't take them back, didn't soften them. She had spoken her truth, and she was ready to stand by it. Max looked at her for a long time. Then the final wall fell. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. But she didn't resist. He held her like she was the only lifeline in a storming sea, as if letting go would mean losing her forever. His shoulders trembled openly now, and Rosalie felt the damp warmth of tears against her hair where his face was buried. "I'm afraid," Max whispered, his voice breaking for the first time since Catherine died. "I'm afraid of losing you, losing the children. I can't survive that again." Rosalie held him just as tightly, her hand moving gently over his back the way she soothed Tommy and Ellie when they cried. You don't have to be alone anymore, she whispered. We'll face it together, whatever comes. They stood there in the darkened study, holding each other, two broken hearts finally finding their way. And for the first time, Max allowed himself to hope that perhaps, this time, the ending would be different. Max didn't run anymore. After that night, after holding Rosalie in the study and admitting his fear for the first time, he understood that pushing her away wasn't a solution. Hiding and avoiding wouldn't protect anyone. The only way to protect his new family was to face the threat and erase it completely. He called Jonas the very next morning. I want to meet Moretti. In person. Jonas was silent for a long moment. Are you sure? It could be a trap. It could, Max replied. But I'm not going to fight. I'm going to negotiate. And I have something they'll want to hear. 3 days later, the meeting was arranged. An Italian restaurant in the outskirts of Chicago, neutral territory, was chosen. Max arrived with Jonas and 2 others, unarmed by agreement. Across the table sat Vincent Moretti, son and heir of the late old man Moretti, flanked by his security. He was young, around 30, sharp-eyed and ambitious, wearing the smug smile of a man who believed he held the advantage. Maxwell Harrington, Vincent began, his tone smooth but laced with contempt, finally decided to show up. I thought you were too busy with your new family. Max didn't respond to the provocation. He placed a leather briefcase on the table, opened it, and slid the documents inside toward Vincent. Before we discuss anything else, you should look at these. Vincent frowned and motioned for one of his men to check the documents first. After confirming they were safe, he began to read. His expression shifted gradually, from smug to surprised, from surprised to angry, from angry to furious. The evidence was about Derek Cole, but not what Derek had done to Harrington, what he'd done to Moretti. The files showed that Derek hadn't just sold Harrington's information to Moretti, he had also sold Moretti's secrets to other families. He'd taken money from 2 sides, 3 sides, even 4, playing everyone like puppets. He'd fed misinformation as well, provoking clashes between Harrington and Moretti while he sat back and profited from the chaos. That bastard, Vincent growled, slamming his hand on the table hard enough to rattle the wine glasses. He played us. He played both of us, Max corrected. I don't know how much you paid him, but I guarantee half of what he told you was a lie. He wanted us at war, wanted us bleeding each other dry, and when it was over, he planned to pick up whatever remained. Vincent fell silent, processing. He was ambitious, but not foolish. He could recognize when he'd been deceived, and he wasn't the type to tolerate it. What do you want? Vincent asked, his tone less aggressive now. A ceasefire, Max said. Not an alliance. I know we'll never be friends, but we don't have to be enemies. We keep our territories. No encroachment, no hostility. And we deal with the man who played us both. Vincent considered for a long time. Then he nodded. Derek Cole. I want him. We handle him together, Max replied. But I'll be there when it's done. He owes me more than money and information. Vincent studied him, and for the first time there was something like respect in his gaze. I heard he did something to your woman. Max didn't correct the phrasing. He did many things to many women, and he almost killed her. Then we have a deal. Vincent stood and extended his hand. Harrington and Moretti cease fire, and Derek Cole will no longer be anyone's problem. Max shook his hand. The agreement was sealed not on paper, but with the word of 2 men in a world where a man's word could matter more than ink. Derek Cole was found 2 days later. He was attempting to flee to Mexico, but he didn't get far. Men from Harrington and Moretti hunted together, and when they located him in a cheap motel in Arizona, desperate and out of places to run, Derek understood his fate was sealed. He begged, he pleaded, he promised everything. No one listened. Derek Cole had played with fire for too long, and in the end, he was consumed by it. Max stepped forward, looking down at the broken man with eyes that held no mercy. This is the price for every tear you made them shed, Max said, his voice a low, lethal promise. He didn't strike the final blow himself. He didn't need to, but he stayed until the silence was absolute, watching the man who had nearly killed Rosalie, nearly harmed the children, nearly destroyed everything he was rebuilding, receive what he deserved. And when it was over, when Derek Cole was no longer a threat to anyone, Max drove back to the estate. Dawn was just breaking when he arrived. The horizon blushed pink, chasing away the long night's darkness. And standing at the front of the mansion, wearing only a light coat in the sharp morning chill, was Rosalie. She had waited all night, sleepless, unmoving, eyes fixed on the road leading into the estate. Max stepped out of the car and walked toward her. His face was tired but peaceful, his eyes no longer shadowed by fear and dread. "It's over," he said softly. "Truly over." Rosalie looked at him, brown eyes brimming, lips trembling. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. She only needed to know he was home. He was safe, and the last nightmare had ended. She ran into his arms, and Max held her, holding tight as if she were everything in the world. Her tears soaked into his shoulder, and he didn't care. He simply held her, breathed in the scent of her hair, felt her warmth against him, and this time, he didn't let go. Inside the mansion, Maggie stood by the window, quietly watching them. She smiled, tears of happiness tracing down her wrinkled cheeks. Tommy and Ellie were still asleep, unaware that when they woke, their lives would be changed forever, for the better. The sun climbed higher, golden light spilling across the estate, and in each other's arms, Max and Rosalie finally found the peace they had searched for through so many years. 5 years later, the Harrington estate no longer resembled the dust-covered place of sorrow and fading memories it once had been. It had become a true home, filled with laughter, voices, and life. The front garden bloomed in a riot of color beneath the summer sun. Rosalie had replanted the flowers Catherine once loved. Pure white jasmine, deep red roses, clusters of lavender fragrant in the warm air. But she had added her own touch as well. Bright yellow daisies and tulips in every shade imaginable, creating a garden that honored the past while welcoming the future. Tommy was now 13, tall and lanky in the way boys are when they're stretching toward manhood. He was no longer the thin 8-year-old with worry-aged eyes. Now he was confident, an excellent student admired by teachers and respected by his peers. He dreamed of becoming a lawyer, not for money or prestige, but because he wanted to defend people like his mother, people who were bullied and had no one standing beside them. Max had heard him speak of that dream many times, and each time pride rose in his chest until it nearly stole his breath. Ellie was 10. No longer the timid little girl clutching a torn doll. She was now a vibrant young artist, her eyes shining whenever she held a paintbrush. Her paintings hung throughout the house, in the living room, along the hallway, in the kitchen, even in Max's study. Her school had hosted a small exhibition of her work, and the whole family attended, applauding proudly as she stood beside her canvases. Max recognized something he never said aloud, that Ellie possessed the same artistic gift Catherine once had. The way she blended color, the way she saw the world and translated it onto canvas. It all echoed his late wife. It wasn't coincidence. It felt like a gift, as if the universe were whispering that Catherine was still present in her own quiet way. Max and Rosalie wore wedding rings now. They had married a year earlier in a small, intimate ceremony in the estate garden. There were no hundreds of guests, no lavish spectacle, only family and the closest of friends. Jonas, now married with a young son of his own, had stood as best man. Maggie cried throughout the ceremony, but they were tears of joy. Tommy walked his mother down the aisle, back straight and head held high just as Max had taught him. Ellie scattered flower petals along the path, smiling like summer sunlight. Max still led the Harrington organization, but he had changed many things. He strengthened legitimate businesses and gradually reduced operations that belonged in the shadows. He worked remotely whenever possible, spending most of his time at the estate with his family. Jonas handled essential matters in the city, and together they built an efficient system that allowed Max to retain authority while fully embracing his role as husband and father. One summer evening, as the sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and violet, the family sat on the mansion porch. Rosalie sat with Ellie in one corner, teaching her how to mix colors for a new painting. Maggie brought out a tray of freshly baked apple pie, its sweet aroma drifting through the warm air. Max sat in the old rocking chair with a glass of tea in hand, gazing at the scene before him with a peace he once believed he'd never feel again. Tommy stepped onto the porch and took the seat beside him. The teenager was quiet for a moment, as if searching for the right words. Then he spoke. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Max turned to the boy he now called his son. "Always." Tommy looked down at his hands, then back up. "Do you ever regret it? That day, when you found us?" Max didn't answer immediately. He looked around at Rosalie, laughing softly with Ellie, at Maggie arranging slices of pie, At the sunset bathing everything in honey-colored light, he looked at the mansion that had once held only grief and now sheltered love. He looked at the garden where past and present bloomed side by side. "That was the best decision of my life," Max said, his voice steady and full of warmth. Tommy smiled, the smile of a boy who had found a family, who had found the father he thought he'd lost forever. "I think so too." They sat shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun sink below the horizon, and in that quiet moment, Max thought of Catherine. He believed she would smile if she could see this. She would love Rosalie. She would love Tommy and Ellie. She would be glad he had found peace. He hadn't forgotten Catherine. He never would. Her photograph still rested on the living room shelf. The painting she created still hung on the wall. But he had learned that the human heart can hold both sorrow and joy, memory and present love, loss and renewal. Loving Rosalie didn't mean forgetting Catherine. It simply meant he had chosen to keep living, to keep loving, to open his heart again despite the wounds it once carried. The Harrington mansion was no longer a place of mourning. It was home. It was family. It was proof that sometimes saving someone else is the very way we save ourselves. And love, when it finds us a second time, isn't a betrayal of the one we lost, but a precious gift life places gently in our hands. This story reminds us that no one has to carry pain alone. Sometimes strangers become family. Sometimes broken hearts find one another and heal together. And sometimes the simple choice to open our hearts and help someone else becomes the turning point that changes our lives forever. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the moving stories we share each day. Press the like button and share this video with the people you love, those who might need to hear stories of hope and love. We would truly love to know how you feel about this story. Have you ever experienced a moment when a stranger unexpectedly became someone important in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We're always grateful to hear what lives in your heart. Thank you for spending your time with us today. We wish each of you watching good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.